So welcome to the Montalcino Masterclass. My name is Charles Lazzara. I am the President and CEO of Volio Imports. It is a pleasure to be with you today. The goal of this is to really just run through what I think is one of the most exciting regions in Italy and really one of the classic wine regions in the world, and that is Montalcino. Specifically, everyone loves to say Brunello di Montalcino, but there's also the little brother, the Rosso di Montalcino, and then a couple of other sneaky little DOCs that you might not be aware of, like Sant'Antimo. And then what originally started this area was a white grape called Muscadella. And we'll talk about that briefly. We're going to break this up into chapters, so to speak. We're going to talk about the region, how it developed, the plate development, what came together to form this beautiful and very special area, and why today most folks that do study the soils, the geologists, in and around Tuscany, really have confirmed these to be some of the most complex soils in Italy, specifically suitable to Sangiovese. We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll get into great detail around that as we discuss really the subzones of Montalcino. These are unofficial subzones. This is stuff that I think, and then others also think, and I've heavily researched, like Karen O'Keefe from her book Brunello di Montalcino, and then also just general discussions I've had over the past 15 years working in wine from Tuscany, specifically Montalcino, talking to producers about how they commonly refer to areas and what they're specifically known for, and really how you develop the taste for these wines over the course of time. So we'll again talk about the region, Montalcino, a little bit of history about it, not too deep a dive, but maybe enough that it's beyond just the casual, it's a wine region discussion, and then a really intense conversation around the soil, the exposure, the climate. We've got a really cool map feature that we'll get into great detail around that shows the elevation gain and the views from some of these wonderful subzones. So without further ado, let's get into Tuscany. So we're going to go back. I know it seems like I just said we wouldn't go back too far in time, but I promise this will be quick, covering the 200 million years of Tuscany in the making. There's a really beautiful video that is a compilation of a couple of different folks. Argiano was kind enough to really do a great dive into their soil, specifically talking about Montalcino. We've taken that off their hands. It's been available from them, so we thank them for that. This really sets the stage. You've got Siena to the north, Montalcino in the middle, and Rome at the bottom. Italy does not run north to south, so it actually sort of runs northeast to, or I should say northwest to southeast. And you can see here how it's developed. The Adriatic plates, the European plate, the African plate all separate. This is the opening of the ocean now over 180 million years ago. I promise you this would be quick. Then, of course, you've got the inner parts of the earth coming out to create land through volcanoes and just general disruptions of the sea, the marine life. This really opens up to create the Apennine Mountains as they're known today and define what is Italy. So the Adriatic plates, again, come back together about 60 million to 40 million years ago. And you have the Torrenian Sea and the Adriatic Sea on each side. And then the Apennines sort of cut through the middle. And that allows us to get to where we want to talk about today, which is the general uprising of the soils in and around the area of Montalcino. You'll see Argiano right there in the middle. Montamiato, which is, we'll come back to that as we talk about the subzones and the influence of Montamiato helping relieve hail and other more troublesome things that can happen in and around the vineyards as you get through frost and hail season. But the really critical part here is that over the course of time, many experts would agree that Montalcino was underwater, and then through the glacial ages and then the thawing out shortly thereafter, the seas receded. And in receding, we're only going to show one example of that here on this video just for the sake of time, but the seas recede. They actually come back a couple of times throughout the course of history, 20 million to as recently as 4 million years ago. And as experts have really commented, this receding and coming back of the ocean in and around the area of Montalcino had a dramatic impact on erosion, landslides, and really layers of earth piling on top of each other as these hills came up through the uprising and continued compression of the two plates below Italy's foundation. As you can see here, the rains came in after the glacial ages. There was a lot of erosion, tremendous amounts of landslide that took these older hills that are towards the top in the areas of Castelnuovo and dell'Abate all the way up towards the top of the hill of Montalcino at about 600 meters above sea level. And these landslides pushed layers of old soil on top of layers of younger soil. We'll talk about this at length, but really the specific impact of the climate is also really critical. You can see the tremendous influence here of the Mediterranean climate to the continental climate. And this was a piece that was provided to me by the folks over at Alliance Vinum, specifically a gentleman, Max, who runs and owns Avignonesi with his partner, Virginie. And in this piece, you'll see the really big influence of the Mediterranean climate coming off of the sea, off the west of Italy, pushing east. And then you'll see right around Montalcino is where that breaks into a more continental climate. And we'll talk about the specific growing areas, the subzones of Montalcino that have more of a Mediterranean influence, like Tavernelle, into even the edge of Castelnuovo and dell'Abate, and less so on the more northeast sides, like Torrenieri, which looks more towards Siena and into Montepulciano. And so there's a really big influence of climate here and how that impacts Sangiovese. It's not enough to have favorable soils for Sangiovese. You need a favorable climate as well, obviously. That area in the southwest portion is Grosseto, which is the heart of the Maremma area. And really there we refer to the Sangiovese coming out of that section of Italy as wild Tuscany or wild Sangiovese, very fresh, generous version of Sangiovese off the sea, a nice coastal influence, really good heat days, no issue there with heat down in Grosseto, but those warm winds can really do some damage to Sangiovese depending on where your vineyards are situated. But there's tremendous potential for Sangiovese from the Maremma. You push northeast into Montalcino, and these warm winds get a little bit cooler as they climb up the hill of Montalcino, but they can be very aggressively hot in that southwest corner of Montalcino in the more low-level vineyards that are in that 180 to 240 meters above sea level category. And that really puts you into Camigliano, into the southwest portion of Sant'Angelo in Scalo. These are tough areas in warm years to make really great Brunelli di Montalcino. And I say that because of just lower vineyards trapping a lot of heat, and they typically harvest about 10 to 15 days before the rest of the DOCG of Brunelli di Montalcino. And then of course, in the northwest part, you'll see Bolgheri. I mentioned Bolgheri only because it's the home to the great wines such as Sassicaia, Ornellaia, Tineta Argentiera, Guadaltasso, Gaia's Camarcando property, and several others. It's a wonderful area to explore great wines from Italy, but you'll see no or very little Sangiovese there. And it really comes down to climate. Even if you have a Mediterranean influence on the climate there, they're on the water, the soils are not well situated to produce great Sangiovese. Instead, they do an extremely good job with more international varietals like Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Petit Verdot, etc. So really interesting area, but that's another discussion for a later time. And then of course you have Montepulciano over there in that more continental climate. And with different soils in Montepulciano and a different climate, you really see different results in 100% Sangiovese expressions from some really interesting cru vineyards coming out of the area of Vino Nobile, and also just the general approach to winemaking is a bit different than you find in Montalcino. So as we sort of get out of this view of the Mediterranean versus continental climate, we come in from the west in the Tyrrhenian Sea. We are coming in sort of as the bird's eye view flying down into Montalcino. You'll see Siena, which looks to the screen left is actually screen in north in terms of the compass, and Monte Amiata. You'll see Monte Amiata there, again, I touched on it a bit before. It has a really interesting influence on the climate of Montalcino. It is basically across the Orcia River, which is the southernmost natural border for the DOCG and DOCs of the area. You have the Ombrone River, which borders the west side. We'll see that highlighted here in a second. Now we are looking sort of north-south in the DOCG of Brunelli di Montalcino, or DOC, just call it the area of Montalcino for the sake of argument. The influence of the winds, the influence of the water, all this is really what defines the great growing conditions for Montalcino. So you'll see the Orcia River on the south, the Ombrone on the west side. There is the DOC of Sant'Antimo, and a lot of great producers, interesting wines coming from an influence in Camigliano for those bigger, more intense wines from the area of Montalcino. You'll see some reference producers: Banfi, Argiano, Soldera, Salvione, Biondisanti, Casanovrineri, and Altazino. We'll talk about some of those here in a little bit as we get into what makes the wines of Montalcino so compelling. So a bit of a brief history here for you. Montalcino, we'll talk about Sangiovese and its clones, and then of course the denominations of Montalcino. So to get right into the history. And again, trying not to go back too far, but it's still relevant in how Montalcino developed and how it developed differently than, say, Florence. And we go back to the 1500s in the 4-year War of Montalcino. I highlight this as a specific sort of overview, only because I think it's relevant that the Renaissance really never impacted Montalcino. You don't see great works of art like you would find scattered throughout Florence and all the areas that were under Medici rule, getting Medici love. Because Lorenzo de' Medici and then his predecessors and subsequent followers, they really drew for us the beautiful artwork and bringing poetry and art and love of passion for the Tuscan landscapes through iconic imagery in the Renaissance period. But when you had Montalcino, which was basically an annex under the Republic of Siena, and there was this really intense 4-year war where the Republic of Siena was trying to fight Florence. When that was done and the Republic of Siena lost, the area of Montalcino became under the Medici rule, and really Lorenzo and Cosimo, they really didn't give Montalcino a lot of love in terms of bringing great art and driving the Renaissance into the area of Montalcino. So it remains sort of a medieval town with a very beautiful but old structure of the 14th century fortezza on top of the hill, which is a really beautiful and iconic piece of Montalcino's history. But you won't see a great impact of the Medici rule there. Then Italy unified in 1865, and it's hard for some folks to remember that Italy is younger as a unified country than the United States. I always find that interesting. It was really separated as various regions and kingdoms of Italy, and you see that translated in everything from culture, language, food, wine, every aspect of Italy. This is what makes it so compelling to travel to. Every part of Italy is so unique. There are over 600 registered dialects in Italy, which is often hard for me, as someone that is fluent in Italian, to understand region to region, and even for Italians when they're in their region that have friends from other regions to understand language, dialect. It's completely different. But really, the foundation of that unification, as it impacted Montalcino, was that a train came to the hamlet of Torrenieri, which is in that north and east portion that we'll see on the map here in a minute. And so that allowed some exposure for the sweet Muscatello grape, and the experimentation of Sangiovese was basically brought to light. At the time, there was only really one family or one individual that was making quality wine from, at the time, Brunello grapes, but as we all know now, Sangiovese grapes, Sangiovese Grosso. It was Clemente Santi. In 1869, he then went on to the agricultural fair in the town of Montepulciano, which is about 20 plus kilometers or 40 kilometers from the area of Montalcino, and he won 2 silver medals for a wine called Vino Rosso Scelto di Brunello. And that was the first documentation, really, of the category of wines from Brunello grapes, or later be called Sangiovese, as I said, of quality. And then in 1879, he started making 100% Sangiovese wines. So again, he was about 100 years ahead of his time. This is why Bionde di Santi is such a critical piece of the history and a great link to the agricultural impact of Sangiovese in the area of Montalcino. You get into the 1930s, phylloxera just crushes Montalcino. And at the time, you look back in 1869, 1879, there was already starting to see that influence of phylloxera in France, some sort of myth and legend of Bionde di Santi, Clemente Santi, making some wines, grafting some rootstock even back then, but that's all sort of lore and legend, really. But in 1930, phylloxera did a number on Montalcino, just like the rest of Italy and Europe had suffered. So you'll see this sort of history of tragedy repeating itself in and around Montalcino, and it really relates to what we see today. The youth of the winemaking culture in Montalcino is really interesting. 60% of Montalcino is organically farmed. One could argue that this is because it is such a young winemaking culture. It doesn't have 200, 300 years of history rooted in deep family tradition. It doesn't have sort of this homage to this is the way we've always done it. It's always been moving forward, and it's moved forward basically because it's suffered time and time again. Post-World War II, which was largely a culture for wood, forestry, farming, related to those sorts of trades with regards to wood, carpentry, cobblers, tailors. These jobs were taken as oil, electricity, plastics became more prevalent in and around Italy. There was less of a need for woodworkers like carpenters, etc. And so this really decimated the community of Montalcino to the point where it was the poorest commune in the province of Siena as of 1950. That is not that long ago when you really think about that. We're talking 2020 today, 70 years ago. this area, it's hard for us to imagine with wines as important as Brunello di Montalcino and some of the price levels that we see for vineyards coming out of that area. It's hard to believe this area 70 years ago was really one of the poorest in all of Siena, and for that matter, one of the poorest in all of Tuscany. 1966, the Brunello di Montalcino DOC status is arriving. Only 76 hectares are in production in 1966, which again, you think about the number of producers today, you have over 250 producers in the area of Brunello di Montalcino, or should say in the area of Montalcino. It's hard to believe that at one time there were so few hectares under production and so few producers making wine as in 1966. The real critical next step after arriving into DOC status was the introduction of consulting enologist, consulting winemaker, or just tastemaker, a gentleman named Giulio Gambelli, who really was the first to introduce the concept of hygiene in cellars. This had a huge impact on the quality of wine coming from Montalcino. This gentleman, Giulio Gambelli, has since passed. He was iconic. He was known as the master taster, the master of Sangiovese in and around Tuscany. He had a huge impact on wineries like Poggio di Sotto, Soldera, Biondi Santi, and many others in the way that they look at wine. Fattoria Barbi as an example in Montalcino, but also in Tuscany, Villa Rosa, which is in Castellina in Chianti, was his sort of everyday cellar because Giulio Gambelli was from Poggio which is an industrial town on the outskirts of what became the area of Chianti Classico. And he had a huge impact with the Cecchi family now is the owner of Villa Rosa, but in this very historic property called Villa Rosa, and then also Montevertine, which is in Radin Chianti, and several other wonderful producers of Chianti Classico, or I should say just Sangiovese in and around Tuscany. But the real cornerstone to Giulio's philosophy that he learned from Tancredi Biondi Santi was hygiene in cellars. Because at the time, again, hard to believe, but in the 70s and 60s, there were a lot of dirt floor cellars in and around Italy. So you can't think of Montalcino, you can't think of Chianti Classico, you can't think of Italy in general, specifically Tuscany, even in the 70s, as a place that would resemble anything like the great Chateau of Bordeaux or these historic cellars and caves in Burgundy, because it wasn't the culture. Wine in Italy has always been and will always be, hopefully, just part of the table. It doesn't become the centerpiece to every discussion. And so it's a very casual consumption. It's part of the everyday life in Italy, and therefore it's celebrated as such. These are traditionally very simple, drinkable wines. And you had this sort of conversion in the 1970s into the mid-80s from quantity to quality. And Giulio Gambelli was really instrumental in doing all of that introduction of hygiene and cleanliness to wine. Again, maintaining the technically desirable parts of winemaking, but not removing the soul of Sangiovese. And that's where he was incredibly helpful and influential in all of these properties. He worked for the Consorzio of Brunello di Montalcino in the DOC as it was in the 1960s, and then DOCG in the 1970s and 80s. Italy became the first, Italy's first DOCG was Brunello di Montalcino in 1980. It is today the only DOCG that requires 100% Sangiovese. The DOC of Rosso di Montalcino is the only DOC that requires 100% Sangiovese. So between the 1970s and the 1980s, really the introduction of quality was instrumental and highly influential, and really opened the door to a very wealthy family from New York called the Mariani family, who came in and purchased Villa Banfi. And really, they are largely responsible, given a lot of credit across Montalcino, for introducing the category of Brunello to the US market, and for that matter, to a lot of the export markets around the world. The Mariani family took the Villa Banfi wines and really bought it for the white grape Muscadella. They're trying to make sweet white wines to bring back to the United States for their wine business and sales in the US. And then they sort of interpreted what was going on with the incredible quality around the red wines coming from Brunello di Montalcino. And they basically converted their farm, Villa Banfi, which is enormous in the southwest portion of the area, converted that to largely Brunello di Montalcino production. And today they're one of the largest landowners, if not the largest landowner in the area of Montalcino, and have the most hectares under vine of DOCG Brunello di Montalcino. So a very influential family, even today, in terms of production and name recognition for the area of Montalcino. But arguably, there are smaller producers that are making some of the more compelling styles of Sangiovese of Montalcino. For my money, I think that it's incredible what Villa Banfi was able to do, bringing wines to the US and marketing Montalcino. But qualitatively, we see some amazing producers outside of Villa Banfi that have really become the forefront of people's minds for what we think of quality Brunelli Montalcino, but hugely important as it regards the history and even today, the exposure for Brunelli Montalcino. 1 in 4 bottles of Brunelli Montalcino is sold in the United States, just to give you some perspective there. So we get into Sangiovese and its clones. It's really, again, hard to fathom the influence of Sangiovese in Italy. We just assume that it's everywhere. And for the most part, it is. It's the most widely planted grape varietal on the red side in Italy. Over 70,000 hectares planted in Italy. It is over 10% of the vine plantings, and it's grown in 17 of the 20 regions. The really critical piece here is it is in so many DOC and DOCGs around Italy, 388 total between DOCG, IGT, and table wines. It's hard to believe that the only one requiring 100% Sangiovese as a DOCG is Brunelli di Montalcino, and only one that requires 100% Sangiovese as a Rosso di Montalcino. Of the other 88 DOC and DOCGs, none of them require 100% Sangiovese. Chianti Classico require 80% of Sangiovese. So for many people, it's hard to understand what is identifiable as Chianti Classico, and that's largely attributed to the fact that it's not always representing 100% Sangiovese. In fact, there's a big movement from some really influential folks, I think very intelligently, in the category of Gran Selezione in Chianti Classico, which is now the one of the more important tiers, recently debuted to the US and around the world, just around, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. The Gran Selezione category is introduced, but it doesn't require that category to have 100% Sangiovese. And a lot of producers are talking about, well, let's bring up that and make it only 100% Sangiovese. And also you see that in the Alliance Vinum in Montepulciano for Vino Nobile, trying to establish crus of 100% Sangiovese to reflect the terroir of the area. And again, I think also compete with what is a really growing consumer awareness to Brunelli di Montalcino and its level of importance for identifying Sangiovese's quality on the world spectrum. In the 1980s, again, that quality movement really took over. Chianti 2000 was this really interesting thing put on by the consortium of Chianti Classico, which delivered over 80 different clones of Sangiovese. This took 16 years. And the real interesting part here is, why would you develop clones? Well, in this movement of quality over quantity, you have to think about the impact of lower yields in vineyards, the idea of delivering the highest quality grapes you can from Sangiovese. And in many circumstances, you found producers finding the healthiest vines in their fields and doing a massal selection, basically grafting some of their vines onto other vines throughout their vineyards. And because they thought, sort of Darwinistically, that these vines perform better in my vineyards, in my terroir, I want to create more opportunity for this vine to have a bright future in my vineyards and protect against the other ones that are more susceptible to disease or the influence of rot with the spacing of the bunches. And so this is sort of the natural way of doing clones. You're basically selecting this massal selection to select budwood in vineyards and then graft it onto other vines so that budwood really becomes more developed in your vineyards and really creates strong vines of specific terroir. In the idea of clones, you're trying to go after a very specific type of grape bunch that may be looser because you want air to pass through these wider grape bunches. You're looking for smaller berries. You're looking to avoid issues like rot, which means, if it rains a lot, which it does in Chianti Classico and in Chianti and also Montalcino, you're not allowed to irrigate in hot seasons. So this concept of developing clones was all around risk mitigation, disease mitigation in the vineyards, in the hopes that you could create really high quality grape bunches, very disease resistant vines that allowed you to have old vines in your vineyards. Old vines, of course, create some of the most interesting and compelling wines for us because they've got deep roots, they have naturally lower yields, and so it really helps create what we look for in terms of complexity and age-worthiness of wines. So this period of the 1980s was really huge in terms of this paradigm shift, not only for the quality movement, but also the research and development of Sangiovese clones in and around the area of Tuscany. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Brunelli di Montalcino and Rosso di Montalcino. A lot of this information came from Karen O'Keefe's book, Brunelli di Montalcino, which is a wonderful resource for folks as they look to expand and learn about the area of Montalcino. Here's a good look, just a very simple chart provided by Wine Folly around the various denominations of Montalcino. You'll see Rosso di Montalcino requires 1 year of aging. You can age a Rosso di Montalcino in 100% stainless steel. Not many people know that. Some producers have views on it where they want a young, approachable style of wine. In general, I think that you would find most producers would agree that Sangiovese needs a little bit of oak aging to soften tannins. And this is why originally, when Brunello di Montalcino was developed, even before it was a DOC, it required 5 years of aging. At one point, it was up to 4 years total in oak. That has since been reduced to only 2 years of oak aging. But really, you will see a lot of producers, the old school producers, those that are rooted in tradition, really going for 2 to 4 years, more leaning towards 3 and 4 years of oak aging, because again, they can put that wine into bottle that is more approachable, has gained incredible complexity through the oak aging process, typically oak neutral, large botti, which are these very tall casks that are made from Slavonian or French oak that are pretty oak neutral, meaning they don't give a great influence of oak flavors on the wine. They're there basically to allow the exchange of oxygen to the wine and soften tannins and really create complexity as the wine ages. Again, Reserva is 6 years total aging, but the Normale is 5, 2 years minimum oak aging for Brunello di Montalcino. Then you see the Sant'Antimo and the Moscadello di Montalcino. Sant'Antimo is a new category, a new DOC in the area of Montalcino. This is sort of come out of, in my opinion, came out of Brunello Gate when they discovered many different types of international varietals in the area of Montalcino. And I think they wanted to give the producers of Montalcino an out on making a wine that wasn't IGT. It became its own DOC called Sant'Antimo. It's really not that well known to the American consumer, because I think largely people look at Montalcino for Brunello and Rosso, and rightfully so. So we now get into the, I think, extremely interesting and a lot of fun, the subzone discussion. So as we start to talk about the subzones of Italy, I think we'll bounce back and forth between Tuscany and then get into the specific areas of the DOCG of Montalcino, Brunello di Montalcino. And here we have a really good look at what I'm going to call the unverified subzones. This is, again, a compilation of my opinion and other people's opinions that have documented it. Like, as I mentioned before, Karen O'Keefe from the book Brunello di Montalcino, the Wine Atlas, you name it. There are various folks around the wine world that talk at length about what we think is the need to divide Montalcino. This is just my opinion, that areas like Montosoli, Canalicchio could also be considered individual areas, even if they're smaller in general than the expansive Sant'Angelo and Scalo or the larger area of Castelnuovo dell'Abate. But I think it's worth talking about, why is Montosoli important? Why is Canalicchio important to the area of Montalcino? So we're going to talk about each one of these subzones. And before we do that, I just want to show you sort of the overlay of Tuscany and the influence, again, as we talked about before, Mediterranean and continental climate. This gives you a really good look at the individual DOCs and DOCGs in and around Tuscany. You'll see that Brunello di Montalcino, if you can find my cursor here, sort of circling this red blot in the middle of the screen, is Brunello di Montalcino. The DOCG, of course, you have the DOC of Sant'Antimo. Everything is buried underneath there, but we're just sort of going highlights here. Montecucco is the area next to Brunello di Montalcino. You do find very similar varietals. You'll also see Vermentino getting more influential here. And then, of course, sort of Morellino di Scansano, Montecucco, Morellino, and then the larger Maremma DOC. Bulgari, as I mentioned, up here to the northwest. And then, of course, the expansive Chianti DOCG, and then Chianti Classico DOCG with its subzones in here. So a really nice view of what pushes the winds and what changes the weather, and then how that influences the way that we look at Tuscany and its various DOCs and DOCGs. But let's really focus in on the area of Brunello di Montalcino. And in doing so, we're going to sort of zoom in and talk about not just the producers within Volio. I want to talk about also the reference producers in each subzone. I think it's also very relevant to talk about the subzones individually. We've got, I think, a good look at the DOCG here, and you'll see the overlay with Castelnuovo, Sant'Angelo and Colle, Sant'Angelo and Scalo. And really from here, you can see with some pretty cool tools from the town of Montalcino, you're not talking about a really long distance from place to place. In fact, the DOCG itself is not that wide or long. You're talking about 7 kilometers from Montalcino at the top of the hill down to Sant'Angelo and Colle. Sant'Angelo and Scalo is about 10 kilometers. Really the furthest section on your way out of Montalcino towards Grosseto in the Maremma is around 13 kilometers from the town of Montalcino. But even, Castelnuovo is about 7 kilometers. Canalicchio, only about 2 kilometers from the top of the hill. And so I just think it's really interesting to see, even with Montosoli at, less than 3 kilometers, you can tell that there's, a lot of diversity in soil. And as we talk about this section, particularly the southwest corner, which is responsible for about 40% of the total production of Brunelli di Montalcino, you can see that if we start over here in Sant'Angelo and Scalo, this particular section, which is Banfi, Coldorcia, and a few other producers that have a large amount of vineyards. And we're talking about this, it's hard to translate this number, but this is around 2,000 hectares worth of area. And of course, that's not all under vine, but it's still worth mentioning that this particular section where you have a lot of heat, very different soils than some of the more interesting and compelling areas that we'll talk about shortly. This is very controversial, this particular southwest section, which has been flattened from the Banfi family over time to create a more simplistic farming approach in Montalcino. As you get over into Sant'Angelo and Colle, it's higher in altitude. Tavernelle, which is arguably one of the more interesting areas for the Mediterranean climate, the right altitude for vineyards, as noted from great producers like Soldera in this specific area, Tavernelle. You get into Castelnuovo dell'Abate, which I think has some really interesting, very compelling winemaking going on there. We'll talk about that at great length. And of course, the town of Montalcino. You really have to regard the area of Montalcino, the town, which is the most historic in terms of the wine production, as north and south, just because they have very different types of soils. They have very different sorts of aspects to them. And because on this northern side, you're typically at a higher elevation, this was traditionally harder to ripen in Brunelli di Montalcino, make really high quality wines. But as global warming has really set in over the past 15, 20 years, this has become a much more desirable area for vineyard production. You've seen before the DOCG shut down, but even today you're seeing new vineyards being planted up here, and they're really getting excellent results with more traditional, very complex, not explosive in terms of fruit. They're not super ripe wines. They're very calm, patient, but beautifully complex wines, offering some really compelling producers. The area of this section of the south part of Montalcino, we'll talk about at great length, as I mentioned. And then I think it's just also very important, as we'll go through map to map, the differences in elevation gain or loss in areas like Castelnuovo and the impact of the town of Montalcino with its height at about 600 meters above sea level, or what you can't see, which is Montamiato over on this section of Montecucco, which really tends to take a lot of the moisture that would otherwise create hail opportunities and the fog opportunities that come in could go into Montalcino and sort of attracts it like a magnet over to Montamiato, which really creates some very interesting opportunities for Sangiovese to develop with an ideal climate in the area of Montalcino. So if we go back to these unverified subzones, again, this is the more simplistic black and white sort of mapped out view. We'll get into the high level view on Bosco, Torrenieri. And I say high level here because I really don't have a lot to comment on. I don't have great history in the wines of Bosco and Torrenieri, largely because there are just a couple of producers to note. I think Castiglione de Bosco does a really nice job. They make some really elegant wines. They're bigger in style in some circumstances, depending on the vintage. But to me, they're just a very nice example of what's going on in Bosco. You'll see the name Castiglione del Bosco. Bosco just means forest. It refers to a heavily wooded area in this northwest corner of the DOCG. Here you've got cooler temperatures. This is historically, again, very susceptible to spring frosts and the fall fogs that are not ideal for maturation of Sangiovese. It can do a lot of damage, of course, as you get into the fruit setting in on frosts. You get a lot of rainfall, not a lot, but more rainfall for sure than the rest of Montalcino. And then the soils themselves, still very interesting in some sections with calestro soil, sandstone, and clay. Elevations range. Again, we're not talking about a whole lot of producers in Bosco, but one of note to me is Castiglione de Bosco. I'll show you on the map over in this section again. Bosco's down in this northwest corner. You get into the microclimate of Torrenieri. This is in that northeast. Again, a controversial section for sure, because you've got, as you'll see as we zoom in to Torrenieri, you'll see it's not as compelling as you might find some of the sections of Castelnuovo, the north and south of Montalcino to be. This is an area that was largely this Crete Senese, sort of clay, compact clay soils. It doesn't have the influence of Pliocene era or the different epochs of types of layers of soil that came through that uprising or the compression that really helped develop Montalcino soils. You're not seeing that. This is largely clay soils making some pretty big wines, and I think not as complex or interesting as you might find from other sections of Montalcino. If we again go back to the various subzones of Montalcino, and then we'll look at now the next producer. But again, Innocenti makes some really wonderful wines out of that area. And I think, again, you'll see more producers look at diversifying their holdings if they have them in Torrenieri just because of the change in the weather. But I think that it's certainly one that would be considered one of the sections for sure. Camigliano, here you get Castelgiocondo, Tenuta la Fuga, and for me, Cupano is probably the more interesting, but for sure the smallest of those three that I mentioned. Cupano, I've known those folks for a very long time. Producer that came over from the area of Armagnac, is a really very French approach to winemaking in the area of Montalcino, has made some incredible wines, very small producer, and I think very, very interesting for the category of Brunelli di Montalcino. But it's great to have Lionel and his wife producing those wines out of Camigliano, because I think they're very different than Castelgiocondo, more aligned to La Fuga, but very, very different, of course, in terms of size and approach to winemaking, Cupano being really committed to organics and biodynamics. So here you've got Camigliano at 130 to 450 meters above sea level. It's in that southwest edge of Montalcino. It's again Pliocene epoch soils of clay, marine deposits. It's an area that was, of course, underwater like a lot of Montalcino, but you really see the influence of some more mineral-driven marine, sort of really sometimes challenging clay and marine soil composition over here. Low elevation vineyards, and again, this results in very warm growing seasons. Not going to be as hot as you would find in Sant'Angelo and Scalo, but you still find yourself with often richer, darker, not necessarily high acid Sangiovese, which is what you would hope to find in Brunello di Montalcino, because it lends itself, of course, to great aging. Camigliano's down here. We can take a good bird's eye view of Camigliano. Again, I don't have any producers noted here, simply because I just think that there's limited opportunity to talk about great producers as you would find in the deep dive that we'll go into here just a moment around the various producers in our portfolio. So we'll take a look sort of moving around Montalcino from north to the west side in these sort of outlying areas before we dig real deep into our sections of Montalcino North, South, Castelnuovo, and then Montosoli and Canalicchio. Here we are in Sant'Angelo. Sant'Angelo is a broad area. I really think that Sant'Angelo can be broken up into two sections, Sant'Angelo in Scalo and then Sant'Angelo in Colle. In Colle is referring to in the hills. I'll show you this now as we look to Sant'Angelo in Colle, and we'll go specifically to some of our producers in the Sant'Angelo in Scalo area. And I think it's just also because the map color changes a little bit easier to the vineyards in the aspects. So Piancronello is in that area in the southwest corner, Sant'Angelo in Scalo. Again, Claudio is farming organically and always has. Small farm in the Piero Agostino section of Sant'Angelo in Scalo. This really sits next to Coldorcia. Coldorcia is, as you look, the Orcia River is the southernmost border. You'll see that here. That separates Montecucco, which is this section, from Montalcino. So Piancronello is really in that southernmost part of the DOCG. But Coldorcia is over in this section here, one of the more historic neighbors. Again, Coldorcia, Banfi, Argiano, all having some of the largest vineyard holdings and producing about 40% collectively in Sant'Angelo. for the DOCG of Montalcino. But Piancronello makes some really interesting wines. Again, wines that to me are more compelling in cool vintages because, again, you're harvesting here warmer section of Sant'Angelo and Scalo compared to the rest of the DOCG of Montalcino. You're harvesting up to 10 days earlier. And in this section, you've got, as we'll take a really nice view into the vineyards of Piancronello, we can get a really, I think, very interesting view of the hill as we sort of zoom in, but drop our axis down and take a look at the ascension into the town of Montalcino. And you can see there's a pretty big gain in elevation. We'll see if we can map it out here and show us. We'll see how good we get with respect to the drop. So consider that the top of Montalcino, that's not necessarily where there are vineyards, but at the top of Montalcino, you've got around 600 meters in elevation above sea level. And we'll just flip this thing so you can see. I think it's a really nice sort of view of Montalcino. And this is, of course, keeping parallel. You'll see the drop. And this is what I refer to. I mean, this is a really good example of a big drop in elevation. You're going to have a warmer area in that southwest corner. And you can see how that impacts. You've got the Orcia River running here that is that southern border of the DOCG. And then you've got Montamiato, which is over in this section as we flip our axis around. Hopefully this will work out nicely for us. You can see Montamiato here up in this corner. So there's a really big influence. This southwest section is largely saved by Montamiato because it attracts that moisture and they avoid hail and a lot of the fog issues that you would otherwise have. You didn't have that mountain pulling that moisture over. And this is, again, resulting in some very warm harvest conditions. You can still make incredibly interesting Brunelli di Montalcino, but the wines tend to be a little bit bigger in style, more alcoholic, perhaps less acidity than you would find at the top of the hill. For sure, you're going to find wines that can lend themselves to more of those stewed or baked aromas. In warm vintages, you can find some more of that animal funk in the Sangiovese. Again, very typical of Sangiovese, but very identifiable to me, at least, as I taste through diverse producers of Montalcino, Brunello di Montalcino, that this to me means that we're in a warmer growing area of Montalcino and lends me to either this southwest section of Sant'Angelo and Scalo or over into areas like Camigliano or perhaps over into Torrenieri, which is, again, that warmer northeast section as you get out into the Cretanese soils. Here, I think the soils are very, very interesting still on the soils. You've got these low elevation vineyards and you've got, I think, really, really interesting opportunities to make some wonderful wines. You'll see Coldorcia mentioned as one of the classic producers, Banfi with Poggialamura. These are three different selections of Sangiovese clones in the Poggialamura vineyards. I think it's a very nice example of Banfi's sort of more historic vineyard and one of its higher quality production products from the winery. But again, not necessarily the best example, for me at least, of Brunello di Montalcino. Piancronello, I think, makes wonderful wines. Il Poggione, again, a larger producer, more towards the Sant'Angelo and Colle section. The vineyards are actually, the wineries are actually near the town of Sant'Angelo and Colle, up at the top of the hill. And then you have Sesti and Vicini. Again, great opportunity here to taste some wines that represent some of the warmer sections of Montalcino for sure. We get to that northern section of Montalcino now, and we'll really take a deep dive into some of those producers that we've got as we again drop back into the various subzones of Montalcino. We'll see that we were down here talking about Sant'Angelo and Scalo, Sant'Angelo and Colle, which is at a higher elevation than Sant'Angelo and Scalo. You have, again, different types of Sangiovese coming from these two sections, but really very different than the rest of the region. We'll talk about Montalcino now as we get into the various producers that Volio has. And then, of course, what I think are just good reference producers for Brunello di Montalcino in these sections. So for us, we can take a look at in that northern section, we talk about Il Meronetto, Le Chiuse, and Fuligni in Montalcino the North. These are calcareous limestone soils coming from the Jurassic and Cretaceous period. The complex soils here result from ancient and repeatedly receding seas. And I said that in the beginning as we talked about the general introduction to how Montalcino developed, but this is really one of the more critical parts here. These soils, these various sort of erosion events that took place over the course of millions of years, led layer upon layer of soil to be recycled on top of each other. And that allows for these vines to penetrate deep into the soil and pull up really complex minerality into the grapes. This leads to really fragrant, high-tone Brunello wines to me. These are all older, more traditional producers in terms of style, using largely oak neutral Slavonian and French oak botti. Again, those are the large oak casks. Why? Because they don't want the influence of oak to mask the flavor profile of what I think are really interesting and long-lived Sangiovese examples from Brunello di Montalcino. And so you look at someone like Il Maronetto Alessandro, produces, I think, some of the best wines from Montalcino period, with Madonna La Grazia as one of those iconic single vineyard crus or reserva bottlings from the area of Montalcino. Le Chiuse makes some wonderful wines, and Follini, really, she was the first female winemaker in Montalcino, and really just a pioneer in terms of overall quality for the wines. Wonderful wines coming from Follini, Le Chiuse, and Il Maronetto. But let's take a little look here at Montalcino to the north. We'll just sort of dig in this section of Montalcino and try and figure it out, because to me that's the fun part. That's why we're here. So we'll just use the reference point of Le Gerla, because we're going to come back to Le Gerla in a couple of events. Le Gerla to me is more in that Canalicchio section, but we'll talk about Le Gerla as it relates to Canalicchio, and then also the influence of Montosoli. And here you have Montalcino. So if we really dig into this northern section, we're going to see, as we sort of drop into that more intense view of the vineyards, we'll see that influence here on this north side, where you'll find some of our friends like Le Chiuse and Il Maronetto. So you really can't talk about the northern part of Montalcino, at least for me, without getting into Montosoli and Canalicchio. To me, these are two very different types of microclimates in the northern part of Montalcino. Here you've got vineyards in Montosoli that are at 280 to 350 meters above sea level. Very different types of soils in Montosoli than you would find in Canalicchio, with marl, loam rock, and limestone. And it's a really soft hill that allows different types of vineyards, different aspects, different elevations. And really some of the more compelling are the north-facing vineyards that go up to 340 meters above sea level. One of the more, I think, important producers for Montosoli as a cru, so to speak, is the Altesino Brunello Montosoli. It's a single vineyard representation. And then you've got some really wonderful producers like Baricci, which is a wonderful old man that makes really beautiful wines, coming to the U.S. now from, I'm not sure who the importer is, but they're lucky to have them. It's a terrific producer. And then Capano, whose cellar's really at the base of Montosoli. They've got some vineyards there as well. They make some wonderful wines. So here you're looking for ripe fruit, earth-driven structure, wines with power. You've got some of the lower elevation vineyards in 280 meters above sea level that go up to 340 or 350. And again, we'll take a look at that cru. And then you've got Canalicchio. We'll look at them both together on the map because I think it's relevant. Canalicchio, 270, 320, so very similar in terms of elevation, a little bit lower. They don't go up to 380, but you got sand, schist, clay, and marl. Again, you don't have the influence, as I talked about, of the loam rock as much as you do in Montosoli here. You got northeast exposure. So these are to me more complex in their structure, longer aging wines than you would find from Montosoli. They're not going to be as ripe as the wines of Montosoli. And they're more elegant, balanced, and not as explosive in the fruit. You know, sometimes you want that ripeness to just sort of pop out of the bottle. To me, the wines of Canalicchio, when you talk about Franco Pacenti or Canalicchio di Sopra, or even the wines of Le Gerla, which are to me the more clean of the three in terms of just like that pure fruit, that more explosiveness out of the palate. To me, Canalicchio di Sopra is probably my personal favorite of the three. Wonderful wines, long aging potential, but the Vigna di Angeli vineyard coming from Le Gerla is really incredible. They've got some of the more historic VBS clones that go back to Biondisanti, one of the very few properties that was owned by Biondisanti and then sold off, in this case to Sergio Rossi in the 70s as they made that transition from Milan, Sergio and his family from Milan down into Montalcino to cover vineyards. So Le Gerla I think is really interesting to talk about in terms of style and in Canalicchio, but Canalicchio di Sopra and Canalicchio from Franco Pacenti are really wonderful producers of reference. So here's a good look at Montosoli. I think it's really just very interesting to go through and take a deep dive, as I mentioned before, about talking about Montosoli and Canalicchio together, but really individually how different they are. Keep in mind the marl, the loam rock, and the limestone. But I think the critical part here is the northern facing success of these vineyards, and you'll see why as we sort of flip to the map and take a deep dive here. So this is, again, facing north. I'm going to sort of drop our view down, and you'll see that just direct north is the town of Siena and Buonconvento that sort of leads you into, you'll see Veneto all the way up north in Italy. I'm going to spin on his axis, but you can see that there's a lot of forest area on the southern and southwestern part of Montosoli. It's a very soft, round hill as we look at just in terms of the elevation from some of the higher vineyards here down to the base. You'll see her dropping in some circumstances 90 meters. You know, as you head out of town, you've got as much as 138-meter drop from the top of Montosoli. And although this, you know, may seem insignificant to the wine lover and not necessarily the wine geek, this has a really big impact on overall production, the way you manage the vineyards, and of course what you're going to grow. So again, we'll spin it around and we'll take a look at how Montosoli relates to Montalcino. We'll see the town of Montalcino come up as we pass by our friends like Siropacenti and Leggera. In the area of Canalicchio, you'll see that the view of Montalcino comes in to the map. And we can see that on the backside, we've got some of our great producer friends on the area of Castelnuovo and dell'Abate, etc. But we'll see the town of Montalcino as we sort of zoom out, and you'll see it on the top of the hill here. And you can see it from here. You've got a lot of the vineyards that face on that northern part, like Il Meronetto, Le Chiuse, Fuligni that we talked about. Those are all living in this section in and around here. And then, as I mentioned before, you drop from some of these really interesting vineyards into Montosoli. And this difference of the hill of Montosoli, and you can see that big difference in elevation, I think all go to create some of those really interesting aspects to the vineyards. You'll see a section of vineyards here in Montosoli. As I mentioned, you've got some success. These are lower elevation vineyards. Well, I'll give you a good view of that here. As we see, this is again a 40-meter drop from the top of the hill. We've got other examples of the town of the top of Montosoli, and we go into the town of Montalcino. You'll see that drop is significant, 330 meters dropping from the top of Montalcino down to Montosoli. Again, northern facing exposure, very different climate than you would find in other sections of Montalcino. And I think, again, creating some really interesting wines and good opportunity for exploration as we look for people to enjoy the wines of Montosoli. I'll back out of Montosoli now, and we'll get into the area of Canalicchio, just because I think that they're making, again, some wonderful wines in Canalicchio, and it's worth following what they're doing in terms of production and who some of those more influential producers are and how the soil is. But you can already tell by the color of the soil how much different Canalicchio is than Montosoli. You're not seeing the influence of the forest. You're not seeing that heavily wooded section. You're seeing vineyards planted in all directions in and around Canalicchio. You're seeing a flatter area than you saw for sure in Montosoli at the top of that soft hill. This is sort of misleading because as you flip Canalicchio around again, this is facing dead north towards Siena. As you flip Canalicchio around, you'll see the section of Torrenieri. That's that northeast section, coming into play. Again, we'll flip it around just because I got a little haywire on my axis there. But as we sort of take a picture of Canalicchio and flip it, you can see the town of Montalcino behind it. And I'll zoom out just so you can see it. And you'll see coming into view is the top of Montalcino. And so we'll zoom in a little bit, and I'll just show you the elevation drop, which is pretty evident as you look to the picture of the hill. But you're getting already a full 155 meters in drop in elevation just from sort of this random roundabout that's got a gas station as you come into Montalcino that some of you may remember if you've been into the town of Montalcino coming from Canalicchio. Some great vineyards here. You've got Leggera, as I mentioned before, that is on your way up to the town of Montalcino, ascending from Canalicchio. You've got just around this area, Il Paradisi Manfredi, Canalicchio di Sopra, Franco Pacenti. The Pacenti family was really influential in this section of Canalicchio, Canalicchio di Sopra and what's known as Canalicchio di Sotto, under Canalicchio. Canalicchio, for reference sake, refers to a small creek that runs through Canalicchio. that you probably can't see on the map, but it just sort of cuts through here. And that like canal, a little canal, basically cuts from Montalcino. But a big influence here in terms of overall vineyards. I think it's a very interesting section to find, very compelling Sangiovese coming from that north side of Montalcino. Again, great producers here, Franco Pacenti, Canalicchio di Sopra, and the old vines, the Vigna di Angeli of La Gerla. Compact structure, long aging wines, elegant and balanced. When you look to Montalcino in the south, now we're going to change our view quite a bit, and I'm going to talk specifically about Podere Salicuti, and that'll help us sort of frame the argument for what is, I think, a really fun area of Montalcino. You've got great producers in the southern part. Historically, the south part of Montalcino is where you find those producers like Biondisanti, Salicuti, Piandellarina, as I mentioned, Barbi, Potazzine, Cerbaiona. You've got some of the more well-known names, arguably, of the area of Montalcino in terms of historical reference. For sure, Biondisanti and Barbi were there in the beginning, helping establish quality wine from the area of Montalcino, really took it out of the poorest commune of Montalcino in the 50s into the wealthiest of Siena in the 80s and 90s, and today with some of the most important vineyards at the Il Greppo estate for Biondisanti. The southern part of Montalcino, calcareous and limes and sandy limestones, really mineral rich, much like the northern side of Montalcino area that was underwater, erosion, this turning of soils led to really thin, well-drained soils. And this area of 360 to 500 meters above sea level is very significant, because when you look to the next section, Tavernelle, that we'll talk about, they're in lower elevation and really not able to do as much with the vineyards that would, or the land, I should say, that would come up above that. The opinion in Tavernelle is that 280 meters, 230 meters is ideal for Sangiovese. Here, you're seeing amazing quality coming from 360 to 500 meters above sea level. Firm tannin, strong primary fruit, but really driven by secondary and tertiary flavors. These are wines of depth, of concentration, but most importantly, that really strange, this really strange interaction of power and elegance that create age-worthiness in wines. I think that as we look to some reference producers in this section, Biondisanti, we can follow their vineyards and see how they look from the Il Greppo estate. Really just a beautiful view here of sort of the rich soils they've got. They're protected in many ways from the outside influence with the forest they've got around their vineyards. You're looking down south here in a second. I'll show you the view to the south. You can see how the influence of Montammiato really, again, attracting the moisture on the southern side, assisting in frost mitigation and fog mitigation. You can see the view from there down the valley, so to speak, that is cut on both sides into the southern part of Montalcino, leading down towards the Orcia River and over into Montecucco. Really just a gorgeous place to make some of the most compelling and interesting Sangioveses we'll find from the area of Montalcino. We go from there, we can follow, as I mentioned, Podere Salicuti, which is just down the street. Here we're not talking about that far from Montalcino. As the crow flies up the river, you're about 4 kilometers. So it's really not that much of a change in distance, but it's a big change in terms of aspect. So you can see the town of Montalcino here. I'll just draw it out for you to show you the distance, just so I'm not lying to you. You're only talking about, from the top of the hill, about 4 kilometers to Podere Salicuti again. Biondisanti, 1.5 kilometers, really small distances, but a world of difference between Biondisanti and Salicuti in terms of the type of soil that you'll see between the two, and aspect and pitch. I mean, we can talk about their difference in elevation. It shouldn't be that significant as we talk about these two. I'll flip it around just so it doesn't look like it's a straight line, but you can see it's only about 28 meters in difference between the two in terms of elevation. We'll zoom into Salicuti here now and just sort of take a look at what I think is really compelling about this section out here. Again, not to detract from Biondisanti, the wines over there are amazing. I just think that as you look at the wines in this section of Montalcino specifically, you've got Barbi up at the top, which to me doesn't make the wines that it used to make, that really put Montalcino on the map. Gianni Brunelli, which is making some wonderful wines. Those are up in this this section here of this particular sort of cutout. You'll see that as I'll drop the extra. See, it's on a ridge at the top of the hill here that drops down significantly. And for us, for Salicuti, you know, as we import those wines, you'll see there's really 4 different sections of the vineyards of Salicuti. You've got what is the Sorgente vineyard here, Piagione, which is this large section, and then what was in the old days called Teatro up here, or Alto Piagione. These make 3 very different types of wines, and the new owners of Salicuti have done a wonderful job really trying to express the terroir and the image. What they're calling cru wines here, with 3 different bottlings of Brunello di Montalcino from Salicuti. Again, you've got this this really, I think, interesting elevation gain from, I'm going to take the top of the hill where you'll find Barbie, and we're going to drop it down 65 meters here. But I think more significantly, if you take sort of the top section of Sorgente and where it goes down, and we're going to drop that over to the road, you'll see there's a 90-meter drop in elevation from this section down to the bottom of the hill. You'll see that played out in many parts of Montalcino, where there's a really significant drop, 100 meters, 150 meters, even in vineyards. You know, we're talking about a 10-degree slope in sections of these vineyards for Salicuti. And you can see that. I mean, the wines are spectacular, but the vineyards are extremely challenging to manage because of this steep pitch. And this you'll find very similar to what you would see in other sections of Montalcino in the south. So really nice cutout here to talk about sort of not just Salicuti, but also Barbi. And again, a very small region. As you take the exit off this is the main road coming down from Montalcino. You take this exit, here you got the start of the Barbi vineyards, and it comes all the way out. Now you've got Gianni Brunelli towards the top. Again, not a large section of vineyards here, but I think you're talking about a total area of 70 hectares that are being farmed, and not all that under vine, obviously, with Salicuti only having about 4.9 hectares of Brunello di Montalcino. So really interesting and cool section for sure of Montalcino, and I think one worthy of attention because you've got 3 very important producers housed here between Salicuti, Gianni Brunelli, and then Barbi. They give you very different ideas on the southern part of the DOCG of Montalcino. Potazzine, Cebayona, and then of course Salvione, Cebayona, even if the cellars are in different parts, basically a butt in terms of vineyards. They're really gorgeous producers, very, I think, traditionally minded. Piandellarino is a producer I think worth noting because of their very hardcore farming practices with biodynamics. Salicuti, Piandellarino, and Stella di Campato sort of broke off from the DOCG, the consortium's representation, because they didn't like what they were doing in terms of some of the rules they were putting in place. And they created SPA for us in English, Sangiovese per Amico, which just refers to them and their approach to wine, what they think it stands for in the area of Montalcino. But they're all great friends. I think Piandellarino makes probably a more intense style of wine from Montalcino for this particular section in that southern part of Montalcino, but a very noteworthy producer, and certainly one that should be on people's maps or on people's lists. So for me, these are sort of the lineup, probably the most intense grouping of producers, with 8 total to be represented, but all excellent in terms of the wine, and I think all very traditionally minded in terms of the way that they approach wine and the structure and the style of winemaking. So here's a great view from Salicuti. You can see what I mean by Monte Amiato in the distance, and sort of the peaks and valleys of this ridge that really cut through the southern part of Montalcino. And you can see that it's largely protected by forest here. You know, about 60% of Montalcino is forest land still. It is not going to get cut down, I promise you that, with their focus on protecting the environment in the area of Montalcino. But for sure, you do find isolated vineyards. You're able to be really innovative in terms of your farming to make sure that you're protecting the land. You know, most of the approach here is that you're renting the land. If you're a producer, even if you own the dirt, you're not going to be there forever. So people are really focused on the environmental character and protection of the land. And to that extent, incorporating that into biodiversity in their vineyards. And we talk a bit more about that as we get into Tavernelle. Tavernelle is really one of those great areas for Sangiovese. It's really considered by some really well-respected geologists and also professors between Florence and Siena as the ideal climate, the microclimate for Sangiovese, largely benefiting from four main components. Altitude is really critical here, 300 to 350 meters above sea level. South-southwest exposure, we'll look at the map here in a little bit. You'll see how that influence of the Mediterranean breeze coming from Maremma is evident. It's visual, you can actually see it. You can feel it definitely when you're in the vineyards of places like Casevase or Pieve Santa Restituta or Caprilli, which are some really good reference producers from the area. This idea of rocky, well-drained soils is not new to us, but of Eocene origins, which is limestone as a base, and then the silicate soil. It's coming from largely considered one formation of soil over time. It was argued before that there were two or three, if you look at some of the notes from Indagata, that have shed some light on more recent decisions made by some geologists out of Italy. So they're really kind of sticking with this Eocene origin, limestone silicate soils as the base. But those are critical pieces, right? Because rocky, well-drained soils challenge vigor of plants. So you really want the vines to struggle to find water. They have to go deeper with their roots. Case in point is Soldera, which obviously is near and dear to our hearts because we import them into several markets around the US. But when you're there, you see good spacing of the vines. You don't need to have densely planted vineyards from Soldera because, frankly speaking, there's already a challenge to the vines to get to a water source. So they're going to go down as opposed to going wide because it's not easy pickings for them to find moisture. You do feel that in warm vintages in Tavernelle. You know, there's good examples of those like 2009. 17 is a vintage coming up that's a warmer vintage as well. It's not necessarily drought conditions in 2017, but it's just warmer in general. And so as you look to those wines, look for them to reflect that in the profile of the wines. A little bit more muscle, maybe a little more fat on them, less acidity, and maybe looking for some of that to reflect itself in the wines, but still should reflect great fruit and a good backbone there. But here again, you're at 300, 350 meters above sea level. That the idea of this Mediterranean breeze, when we look at this image here, and again, here's Tavernelle, it's always important to look at Sant'Angelo and Scalo and Camigliano. As I commented before, these two regions, Sant'Angelo and Scalo and Camigliano, these are warmer regions. We'll look again at the distance between, just for points of reference, Tavernelle, you're 3 kilometers, 3.5 kilometers here, and then from there down to Sant'Angelo and Scalo, 6 kilometers. There is a tremendous amount of difference. I'm not going to get into the elevation differences here, but as we talked about before, you've got Sant'Angelo, you've got differences in soil that reflect that in the way the wines are constructed. You see bigger styles of wine. The same with Camigliano, a bit more extraction. Tavernelle, you're looking actually for really beautiful fruit, great acid backbone to the wines. Lower elevation, Sant'Angelo and Camigliano with reference to Tavernelle, as I mentioned before, 300 to 350 meters above sea level here, southwest exposure, and then these rocky well-drained soils. We'll take a little peek into Soldera. As again, just mentioned, it's a great reference producer for us. You can see, as opposed to areas like Castelnuovo or the north and south side of the area of Montalcino, you don't see these really dramatic drops in elevation from one vineyard to the next, or even within vineyards like we would see with someone like Salicuti or even Stella di Campalto between, her farm and Poggio di Sotto just up the road sort of thing. Instead, here you're looking for a bit more gradual landscape. We're going to sort of drop our axis a little bit. We're going to shift over so that we look out towards the Maremma. And I think this is relevant for a couple of reasons. One, it gives you an idea of the influence of the sea. You've got a very strong Mediterranean breeze coming in here. You can see the Ombrone pushing out into the water, Sardinia here in the distance, and then Val della Rosa, which is in the Maremma area, producer that we work with from the Cecchi family. It's a wonderful winery. And so here in Tavernelle, you've got the Mediterranean breeze, which if you were at lower elevation, like you would be in Camigliano or in Sant'Angelo in Scalo, that brings more heat to the vineyards. But because you're at a higher elevation, some of that heat has become cooler, and it also chases away the rain. So you're really fortunate in a classic vintage. Again, you can show some struggle in a warmer vintage, a hot vintage, or a drought vintage, because you're just not going to get as much moisture, and you've still got that wind coming through to dry off the grapes. So you don't look for dehydration as a byproduct of that, but just to note that, some of these producers in and around the area of Tavernelle, they may offer you really beautiful fruit in the classic vintages and then wear it a little bit on some of those warmer vintages, which is very typical of people that are making really good wines. You know, they're going to show vintage to vintage. But nonetheless, here as we sort of scoot into Tavernelle and we look at Soldera in greater detail, we'll try and here and follow Soldera as I mentioned before. We'll just sort of zoom around. One thing to note with Soldera specifically is the idea in the 80s of really a pioneering concept, which was biodiversity in the wineries intentionally. So Gianfranco Soldera and Graziella, his wife, moved down from Milan in the late 70s to start Soldera. Early vintages in the 80s were already wonderful wines. That's how his reputation was really built. But you can see down here in this quad, in this little section, this is a 2-hectare garden, 1,000 species of roses, really introduced the idea of cross-pollination between this vineyard block here and the overall environment, the ecosystem of the vineyards. It doesn't seem like a foreign concept today because all you hear about are winemakers and bees and other types of biodiversity, you know, introducing donkeys and chickens if they're going down the Demeter path, the idea of planting fruit trees to bring more insects that are predators to aphids that grow on and can be dangerous to the vines for great wine producers. You know, that concept today is being talked about a lot. Back in the 80s, it was relatively inconspicuous. You didn't really hear anyone talking about, oh, I really need to create biodiversity so that I don't have these predators in my vineyards. Then it was chemical. But here you had Gianfranco Soldera saying, no, I have a beautiful property. I have an ideal climate. I have the Mediterranean influence, and I really want to focus on making really wonderful wines from healthy vineyards, healthy grapes. As a byproduct of that, you know, as I talked about before, you have less density in the vineyards because you already have a bigger challenge with these well-drained soils of limestone silicate substance. You've got biodiversity here between these cross-pollination of the vineyards, and you've got a really high standard of quality selecting from what could be a total of over 40,000 bottles to down to around 15,000 to make a really high quality Sangiovese. Today, the wines of Soldera are not actually classified as DOCG Brunello di Montalcino. They're IGT Sangiovese for some political reasons, but the wine is absolutely a symbol of quality for the region and really an absolute representation of the quality of fruit you get from Tavernelle. So again, I'll zoom in a little bit to Soldera, and then I just want to flip it so you can see some of the rolling hills that I had talked about before. Again, you're not going to see those huge drops. You've got Bosco here. Now we're looking almost dead north. Bosco's up here in that northwestern quadrant. As we continue to drop down and take a look, you can see it's a rolling hill. You're not seeing those big sweeping changes like you would if you were in Castelnuovo or the southern part of the region from Montalcino off the fort. And again, you've got that influence of the coast and then that warmer region, Sant'Angelo Scalo, that really helps us avoid some of the pitfalls of heat in Tavernelle. But again, as I mentioned before, lack of moisture because those breezes from Med really just sweep that rain right off the face of Tavernelle, and it goes over into Bosco, which is lower lying, more forest, or it's protected, or Sant'Angelo Scalo. So a really interesting look here at the region, the microclimate of Tavernelle. Again, the idea that you've got a couple of great reference producers here, but largely those price points are not in reach for the average consumer of Brunello, which is already in a pretty elite group of wine drinkers around the world because the wines of Montalcino are not inexpensive. But for sure, you're talking about prices on Soldera Casabasse of $500–600 a bottle. Pieve Santa Restituta from Gaia, also not inexpensive. Caprilli is probably more approachable in terms of price point. They have some wonderful wines to explore as well, and also a very good representation of Tavernelle in terms of great quality from the region. So this takes us to one of our last sections of Montalcino, the masterclass here as we're calling it, and that's Castelnuovo dell'Abate. To me, and I think to many others, these are some of the most compelling wines in the region today. And I refer to, and I don't think I've stolen the phrase, but as it applies to wine, but it's sort of the iron fist and the velvet glove here with respect to Castelnuovo and the structure of these wines, the fruit-driven nature of the wines, but you know, in great examples like Poggio di Sotto and Stella di Campo Alto, these wines, they've got just this life to them, this energy that I think is uncommon in other wines that you find from Montalcino. And it's this really complex calcareous marl, shale, and stone mixed with clay, and these pretty significant elevation drops. A lot of the producers that have vineyards on the northern side of Montalcino that historically have been cooler in climate, they're trying to find something that aligns with their vineyards that doesn't alter the taste of their wines, but certainly brings diversity in their vineyards so that they're not as affected in cold growing seasons. They've been gravitating towards Castelnuovo. Vineyards in the south, that Sant'Angelo and Scalo section, if they had the ability to, they would buy in Castelnuovo because, one, it was close proximity to vineyards, but two, it did not suffer from the heat as you found in warm vintages. It's got this really beautiful face to it that really attracts cool breezes from both Montemagno because of its proximity there, and then also just its overall exposure to the more Mediterranean side of Montalcino. So it's really an amazing place to visit, number one, to see the beauty of the landscape of Montalcino, but two, for winemaking, for grape growing, it's exceptional in terms of the style, the structure, and the capacity of these wines. So 200 to 450 meters in elevation, southeast of Montalcino. Listen, you're looking for fruit-driven wines for sure, but with a really strong mineral backbone and really great opportunity for complexity. So if you look to Mastroianni, which is a traditional producer, wonderful wines and style, Ciacci Piccolomini, which lives just on the other side of the Abbey of Sant'Antimo, sort of as you take this road called the Sesta that drives towards Sant'Angelo and Colle. Those are amazing wines, very typical of great Sangiovese, some wonderful representations from Ciacci Piccolomini. Again, I'm just trying to offer you reference producers from the region. Ciacci Piccolomini, Mastroianni are more price approachable for sure, Poggio di Sotto and Stella di Campalto. But regardless of price, are amazing wines and very good examples of high-level Sangiovese coming from Montalcino. Again, here's a good view on the map of Castelnuovo here on the middle third of the screen, Ciacci Piccolomini just behind it, and then you've got Stella. I want to sort of focus on this section of Castelnuovo. We're going to flip it around so you can see Ciacci Piccolomini over here on Castelnuovo. Again, it's a little bit lower in elevation. We'll talk about that. And this is also just a reference point for where the vineyards are for Stella and where the cellar is for Ciacci Piccolomini. Again, not a significant drop, to me at least, in where the vineyards are and the location, but you're talking about 30 to 50 meters in drop from the top of Stella down over to Ciacci Piccolomini. But for sure, the more important part for me here is this top of the hill and down to the bottom, you've got a really significant drop as you get out of Castelnuovo. And we'll just take a little cutting of it so you can see. And I think really, again, we're talking about one of the more interesting and compelling sections as we sort of take that cut out. You're dropping 156 meters in elevation from the top of the hill from Stella, which sits on this section called Podere San Giuseppe, which is sitting just below the vineyards of Poggio di Sotto. So as we sort of zone in on what should be closer to Poggio di Sotto in terms of what I just identified, you'll see that this section starts to come alive. So this ridge really just stops at the end of the hill here. And this is a very famous Castello Vallona, which really owned a large section of this area of Castelnuovo dell'Abate from a noble family. And these families entered into what was called the Mezzadria system, which was basically sharecropping, where if you owned this area, you were into what often was referred to as promiscuous farming or polyfarming. You'd have some olive trees, you'd have some grapevines, you'd have some cows, some chickens, and you would share the fruits of your farm with the noble family here. And that was basically in play through the 50s in Montalcino. And then these noble families sort of broke up or sold off their land because they had to from Italian laws changing. And so Stella was able to, through various means, take ownership of her land, which she started early, really in 2002 in terms of estate biodynamic bottling, but it's been certified organic since 1996. But she's young in terms of overall production. The estate wasn't established until 1992. from Stella Campalto. So she's new to the area, quote unquote, new to the area, but making some of the most incredible wines in the area. So you'll hear her talk about it when you get a chance, if you get a chance to talk to Stella about the way that she came into ownership of the vineyards and what she's done since she's taken ownership. But she really does understand how this area has changed, how Castelnuovo has really shaped Montalcino today, and really the significance of this area of Castelnuovo on wines from Montalcino. And again, this ridge really just shoots out straight. You'll see the drop in elevation from the top of the ridge here, basically from the hotel of Castelvellona into this section, 165 meter drop. I mean, it's, you know, that's huge in terms of agriculture. How do you farm? What's the change in temperature day to night at the top of the hill compared to the bottom of the hill? You can see great producers up in this section, just on top of Stella's vineyards here. There's this road that cuts through, and then you've got Poggio di Sotto living up in this section here, again, making some of the most classic versions of Brunello di Montalcino. And for us, you know, as we zoom into Stella, you can see beautiful soils, great aspect. She's, as you can see, I'll go north-south just so it's easier to identify from her vineyards. But now you got facing direct north, so you can see most of her vineyards are facing southwest in terms of exposure, and really just some of the most attractive vineyards and wines from the region. Going back to the types of soil that she's got, you know, again, you look at Ciacci Piccolomini, Mastroianni, Poggio di Sotto, and Stella, it's really benefiting from these calcareous limestone marl soils. And you can see 4 different types of soils. These are all coming from Stella's vineyards in and around Castelnuovo. And she's a small producer. We're talking about 7 hectares of land. And she's producing, and look at the different types of soil coming from just 7 hectares, all attached to each other that she's got. So again, a really good example. This is sort of the deep dive into Montalcino. I hope that you've enjoyed it. And really thank you for taking the time to look at the changes in altitude and elevation, the different microclimates in the various unverified subzones of Montalcino. And thanks for coming on the ride. We hope you enjoyed it.